Welcome to the Wheelers Centre on this wintry night. Let's get some science into our souls and a bit of art. This has been a series, Art and Us, and this is Art and Science. And we have Briony Barr, Leah Heiss and James Saunders, so I welcome them. My name's Alicia Sometimes, and I'm so glad to be with you. Art and science, I guess, is more than just Breaking Bad, isn't it? Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, felt that the pioneer scientist must have a vivid, intuitive imagination for new ideas, not generated just by deduction, but by artistically creative imagination. Einstein loved music, especially the violin. Feynman loved painting and playing bongo drums, so not so different from Matthew McConaughey. Douglas Hofstadter, a Pulitzer Prize-winning cognitive science and a professor also of history and comparative literature, was also known to, in his spare time, to find beautiful patterns in mathematics, poetry and music. There's Arts and Science Journal, and I just wanted to start with this Whitman poem that's very short, Walt Whitman. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in his lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out I wandered off by myself in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. I think we've all sat there and pondered what did it mean, and these wonderful artists have gone so much further. I wanted to introduce first James Saunders. He's an actor who's appeared extensively on stage with the Sydney Theatre Company, Melbourne Theatre Company, Company B Belvoir, Bell Shakespeare, on film, on television, and his new theatre show Fugue is currently in development in collaboration with neuroscientists at the Florey Neuroscience Institutes, University of Melbourne and Monash University. He comes from a medical family, so he's got science in the veins. Just tell us a little bit, James, about who you've sort of played on stage and sort of the scientists that have inspired you.
I've acted obviously in lots of different sort of genres and characters, but when I've come to make my own work, I've always found myself drawn to science and scientists as characters, and also to scientific work that I think displays a real sense of a lot of the things that Walt Whitman talked about, and a sense of scientists that have had a great sense of wonder, a real sense of creativity, that have thought very perhaps far ahead and then tried to work backwards and make it reality. The first show I wrote was about a clinical psychologist called Harry Harlow, who worked in the 50s, 60s and 70s with baby rhesus monkeys. He was a very interesting man. I think had a lot of
problems,
but was striving and was looking sort of forward. He was the first scientist to use the word love in a scientific paper, and he risked sort of being excommunicated from the psychological community. He was a very brash kind of man, and that covered up a lot of sort of personal issues. But what was interesting about him was that his work really mirrored his personality, and he was obviously searching for to answer questions in himself that perhaps he didn't know the answer to. And that work then went very different directions and very ethically questionable and quite difficult work. A lot of which, the results of which have been taken by us and used for the betterment of us, but at the time, he's one of the reasons the animal rights movement started, and he's a very interesting person. I've been involved in a film project that came to MIF actually last year. I was involved in the very early stages, which was developed at the Max Planck Institute for Genetics in Dresden a number of years ago by a colleague and great filmmaker, Erin Sheehan. But the work at the moment that I'm making And this has been a long process, and it will continue to hopefully not be quite so long before it gets seen, is called Fugue, and that's based in the world of neuroscience, hence the work with the Florey and the University of Melbourne. I find I'm attracted to scientists and science where, and particularly scientists who have an understanding of even though their work might be very technical and it is perhaps works with very intricate detail, scientists have this sense of a continuum that comes from way back, philosophy, theology, and art. And I had a conversation I was talking at a party surrounded by a few friends, and I mentioned that I was interested in the man who invented the transorbital lobotomy, a guy called Dr. Walter Freeman, speaking of vilified physicians. And his son, who was a game-changing neuroscientist. And this friend of mine overheard me mention his name and turned around. And he's a neuroscientist and a mathematician. And he said, "Why on earth are you interested in this human being, this neuroscientist?" And I explained to him, and he said, "Oh, I've read all his papers, I know all his work, we should talk." And we found we had the same favourite painter. We were able to talk about experiences we'd had viewing art or talking about philosophy and why I was interested in this particular area of work. And so those kind of friendships or collaborations have really started to happen. And the show is about the brain, but it's about various characters that exist in this particular brain, and it's about story and why we are, and how the neuroscience of consciousness, which is really in our consciousness now, I think it's in the zeitgeist, a lot of people are now talking about the actual neurological things that are occurring to make us who we are. But we are talking about it not just in terms of the science, but in terms of story and how we communicate story, our own story and story that is made, that we view in a theatre or in film. And it all comes back to the brain and what's actually occurring. So that's the current sort of project at the moment, and I could talk for the next 6 hours about it. So
well, we will come back to questions. I have so many questions about your brain.
Okay.
Our next guest is Leah Heiss, and she's a Melbourne-based artist and designer whose practice is located at the nexus of art, design and science. I love the marriage of all those three, using advanced technologies to develop potent human-scale projects. Her process is deeply collaborative, working with experts from nanotechnology through to manufacturing, and her current projects include new forms of hearing technologies, biosignal sensing jewellery, how cool is that? Emergency jewellery for times of crisis, swallowable devices to detect gas fluctuations within the body, and ongoing experimentation with next generation materials such as magnetic liquids, memory metals, and electricity conducting textiles. I loved seeing her piece Polarity 2012. It was an installation with magnetic liquid, propylene, glycol, ethanol, glass vessels, motors, rare earth magnets and table. Isn't she the coolest person on earth? Tell us a little bit about your work.
I'm not sure about that, but thank you. So my practice is located between art, design, science and technology, and is really motivated by the desire to develop devices that improve or even save life. And so I've worked quite extensively with scientists, particularly nanotechnologists and biomedical scientists. I was artist in residence for a year with a nanotechnology company and designed jewellery to administer insulin through the skin for diabetics, and jewellery and water vessels to remove arsenic from drinking water in countries like India and Bangladesh. Since that time, I'm working at the moment with St Vincent's Hospital to sort of design a necklace to replace the cardiac Holter monitor for people that have recently had a heart attack. And I guess at the crux, or the central core of my practice is this idea of empathy, and that's empathy between people and the technologies that we use. And I'm not sure about you guys, but I tend to find that medical devices are pretty horrible most of the time, and very few people I meet say, "Oh, I love this heart monitor, it's really beautiful and I'm so glad it's part of my life." Usually it's, this is something I have to use, I don't have a choice about it, but I do love my wedding ring, or I do love this scarf that was given to me by my grandmother. And I guess I'm trying to harness the potential of nanotechnologies and microelectronics to add veneers of technology to things that we already have existing relationships with. And as an example, I use my wedding ring. So my wedding ring symbolises a whole series of things, you know, love, commitment, family. But there's a potential for me to augment that with a layer of nanotechnologies so that it also delivers the drugs that I need through my system, or perhaps it's a diagnostic device that senses my heart rate every 5 minutes and stores that information somewhere. So I'm trying to sort of think about how we can bring together things that we actually like and things that we need as we age together into packages that people actually want to have as part of their life. And I guess the final thing within the practice is that it's purely transdisciplinary. And I was thinking on the way here, I actually can't do anything on my own. And I laugh about this, but this is quite true. My projects have no value without transdisciplinary collaboration. So they cannot exist, they cannot come into being without the collaboration of scientists and doctors and electronics people. And it's in that fusion of the different disciplines that the magic starts to happen and things of value can occur.
Extraordinary. And last but not least, Briony Barr is a visual artist whose practice investigates individual and collaborative rule-based drawing. As an extension of her individual process-based methodology, she regularly collaborates with scientists as well as large groups of people to generate artworks. She's had an ongoing collaboration with astrophysicist Andrew Malatos, and she makes large-scale drawings. She's also part of an artistic collective called Scale Free Network. It was interesting to see on your Vimeo website, it had a quote from Paul Klee that says, "Drawing is taking a line for a walk." And on Andrew's website, he had a blackboard and it had "The theorist ignites a supernova behind his whiteboard." And it was just this crazy calculations and it looked like a beautiful piece of art. So I saw the similarities there. But tell us about your drawings and beyond.
If I can just say, when I went to meet Andrew for the first time and saw that whiteboard and saw all the layers of drawings, I thought, I think I'm going to be able to work with this guy. My practice involves working with Andrew Malatos, who's a astrophysicist, but more importantly to what I'm doing, he is very... he has a very good understanding of complex systems. And so when we work together, we make rules for large collaborative drawings that are enacted on the floor using tape. So instead of taking a line for a walk with a pencil, you're taking a line for a walk with coloured tape on the ground. And we use the rules as a way to investigate how different interactions between people in a system create more than the sum of their parts. So different people, different components of a system through their interactions build the drawing and build the patterns that we see, all around us. I mean, things like schools of fish or birds exhibit these kind of patterns that are evolved from the bottom up. So we're using the drawing as a way to, and the people involved as a way to show how a system develops and those forms emerge from the bottom up.
It's interesting, you've all talked about connection, especially with empathy and just collaboration. Claude Bernard, a French physiologist, said, "Art is I, science is we." What do you guys think about that? Do you think it's, artists are about looking inwards, science is outwards? Is that fair?
I think everyone does a little bit of everything. I mean, I know scientists are highly collaborative, but I mean, artists are as well. I mean, there's that idea that, artists are in their ivory tower, not communicating with everyone and slowly going mad. But I think a lot of the artists that I know do work collaboratively, with each other across different disciplines, and so do scientists. I mean, you only have to look at a scientific paper to see, there's like 100 names on the paper. That knowledge wouldn't have been generated without all that collaboration. So I think it happens on both sides, collaboration.
Yeah, I would say too that, with contemporary practice and with, these sort of post-digital practices, that it's not possible to have that division anymore. So you can't do the kinds of projects that we're all intrigued by and be a solo artist in a studio locked away.
I think certainly for my practice, if it's in a theatre is by definition a collaborative medium, and I know that when reflecting on the process that I would go through, and talking to scientists about scientific method and the way that they would go about experimenting, I mean, for me, I've always seen that even though I may have written the script, I work with a video designer, a composer. This show has 5 actors and a director, and really I've found, and this can be difficult if you've written something, is that as soon as you're in a room with other people, everything changes. And actually it's very much like a process. I'm literally just creating the initial conditions, and even though I poured my soul into a script, they really just form the initial conditions for collaboration. So they are the script is one of the conditions, and my performance, or the actor's performance, and the composer and the video, everything changes. And the number of times I've had to sit and watch a director with a red pen say, that was really interesting, but it's not interesting anymore because all these other things have happened, and you sort of have to allow that process to occur, because a great show should be, it's like a harmonic in music. It should be something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So, and that requires everything to be happening in concert.
So I think it's an outdated quote. I want to ask specifics, starting with you, Leah. I mean, how did your life begin as an artist that crossed over with the scientific community? Because did you start out making beautiful design objects, and how did you fall into scientific objects as well?
I guess I was always interested in the nexus between things, and so it was through my master's with the Spatial Information Architecture Lab at RMIT that I started to develop heartbeat sensing garments. So this was all about how you might recreate the condition of empathy that occurs in face-to-face connection over distance, and that was looking at sort of the neuropsychology of empathy and why people connect. And through doing that project and wanting to create these extraordinary artefacts and garments that facilitate empathy, I had to find biosignals engineers and electronics people, and I worked with various fashion designers, and I guess it sort of just became my modus operandi. Yep. And then after that, I guess, moving into the nanotechnology side of things is when I started to move into healthcare or therapeutics.
Did you find people excited to be working with an artist?
Yeah, I mean, I don't consider myself purely. I'm sort of artist designer, depending on where I am, and I think I sort of navigate that little terrain between art and design quite well. So when it suits the purpose, I'm more of an artist, and when it depends what happens. Yeah. But yeah, I think so. I think there is initial reservation, and I'll find that whenever I'm at a table with scientists or at a table with doctors or, whatever it might, cardiac surgeons. But I think it's all about language and knowing enough of enough a little bit of enough languages so that you get an inroad and that trust is formed. Yeah. And I realised this today when I had morning tea with 6 electronics boffins in the electronics department. Cool. And they were sort of thought, who's this girl, for a start? They were all sort of 60-year-old boffins, with their electronics wires. And I know enough of that language to say, well, we're doing this and we're weaving these wires and, we want to detect these sorts of signals that the barriers start to go down and then we can start to kind of connect and communicate. Yeah, and I do think one last thing is that if you make things, beautiful things, and you take them in and you show people, then people become engaged in the idea, because it's not just an idea, it's an artefact or a piece of jewellery or something that people can connect to.
And it becomes a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
That's interesting what you're saying about language, James. I was wondering, how do you translate sort of the language of the scientist to make it an interesting thing, something full of heart?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's a very good topic to bring up, the idea of language, because you would see it, I guess, as a barrier as an artist going into, particularly when I've sat with a group of scientists talking about this particular topic, the brain and the science of consciousness, and I realised that I had to read reams and reams of scientific papers in order to engage in the discussion, because while I could intuit a lot of what they're talking about, I lacked the vocabulary and I lacked the jargon to really then be able to interact and to communicate with them. And the ironic thing is that then once I'm tip of the iceberg still, but now that I'm starting understanding that, the ironic thing is that I now have to work backwards again, because in order to dramatise something or to make something, if I may have spent the last 3 or 4 years reading papers, and so I'm comfortable with certain things, but if you're in an audience, you have to grasp it like that, and I have to find a way not only to make it intelligible for an instant for an audience, but also dramatically interesting. And that's another important thing about language for this particular show and a lot of my work, because it might be really interesting and it's fascinating to me and inherently interesting, I think, to everyone, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's particularly dramatic or it works as a piece of drama or a piece.
You don't necessarily want to be just illustrating the science.
No,
just
that's
straight.
absolutely.
I mean, that's where the art comes in, is to translate it into something
that
right. Wouldn't be otherwise. Otherwise, you just read the paper.
Yes, that's right. So that's
That's
very true.
Yeah, because I found being artist in residence with a nanotechnology lab, that their art, any kind of correspondence that they had with art was all about representation, and either zooming in on a nanoscale something and blowing it up, or making 1,000 times bigger version of something. And I was like, no, we don't need to do that. We don't need to have a gigantic syringe and a gigantic... There are other ways of communicating.
There are a lot of collaborations, I think, which are just about taking the data and making it look better, more readable, more accessible, prettier, and that's fine too, but that's a different, that's maybe not as rich of a collaboration.
Tell us about your drawings, Briony. Just because if you've seen videos there's many people involved, to just take us through the process. And you talked about when you met with Andrew, there was rules and so forth. Tell us some of the rules and what you set up.
Okay, so the process of drawing involves somewhere between 20 to 30 people, and may go for a day or 4 days. I think that's the longest I've ever done it. And the rules are very simple. So if anyone knows anything about complex systems, you'll know that for something complex to develop, you don't need to start with something complex. So, life being the longest running, one of the longest running complex systems, all of these amazing forms have evolved, through that system. But, we started with basic components, proteins and amino acids and stuff, which have fed back and evolved over time, to create life. So the rules that we use in the drawings are quite simple, and may be something like, put down a piece of tape that's 10 centimetres long and then turn at a 60-degree angle. And if you hit somebody else's line, then you must turn. Or if you hit somebody else who's making a line in real time, then, you must do X, Y together. And then, there are other rules that might refer to existing systems in nature. So, for example, ants communicating with pheromones. So, the way that ants build their nests is a complex system. I mean, on its own, ants can't do that much, but But together they can build these incredible nests and, deal with enemies and find food and all that kind of stuff. So the rules might refer in some way or be taken from nature in some way. We've made up rules that where all the participants have a genetic code, and then depending on when they interact or meet in the drawing space, they sort of have children together in the form of new drawings, and then there may be rules about how many children that they can have. But through that process, the forms build up in the drawing, and patterns emerge. And Andrew and I can predict some of the patterns because, we have to think of rules and marks that, are going to look good or be interesting or have some kind of cascading feedback effect within the drawing. But then there are things that we just can't possibly know, and that's the mystery of complex systems is we don't have the language. I mean, science doesn't have the language yet to really understand how complexity, they don't have there isn't the math yet behind it to fully explain it. And so through the drawing process, it's a way that we can both be, I think what we were talking about before, being invested, I think it's a genuine collaboration. It's a more interesting collaboration on both sides if both sides are excited about what could come out of it, invested in the idea. So, there's only so much we know about what's going to happen with these rules, and then it's about giving it up and seeing how the system will develop, and then how the drawing will look.
There's quite a few people who have pondered whether their art has a mathematical formula, whether a perfect artwork or a perfect face or a perfect thing of beauty can have a mathematical formula. I'm just wondering, all of you obviously have dealt with scientists, and we spoke that you've spoken to scientists. What are the scientists thinking about the artists? I know they're not here, but let's imagine talking to them. In your experience, we'll start with you, Leah.
Okay, great. We found that there were sort of tremendous benefits to the scientific organisation of having someone embedded for a long period of time. And
I like that, embedded.
Yeah, so embedding is something that I've been thinking about a lot and starting to write about, and the positive outcomes of having a creative embedded in scientific organisations from the beginning of innovation processes. And this is, particularly where I'm interested in, therapeutic, whatever they might be, things for health and well-being. But if you can have an artist in there from the very beginning, that artist is asking quite difficult human questions that the scientists are trained to be focused on a problem for a period of time, and by virtue of the types of work that they do tend to, they hone down on that problem and are trying to solve that problem. But you have a creative in that space, and they're asking questions, they're asking ethical questions, 1 year into the development process that are going to impact on human lives 10 years later. And I think, that's a really important thing. So it's about, having that person there asking those questions, and that has impact on the way that that scientists communicate complex ideas. So you have a layperson in a lab who's saying, I don't get it, can you explain that in really simple language? And so the scientist, we come back to language again, has to develop the language to discuss things simply. And through that, learns new language, how to discuss complex things simply, and then is able to go and talk to the non-scientific public and discuss things simply. And it starts to kind of snowball. And after a number of years, we all have quite a different way of understanding and talking about complex things that are happening. And that's been my experience.
Yeah, I love that.
I think that you raise a good point about the time at which an artist or someone in the arts field becomes involved, and I think that sometimes, perhaps in the past, art about science has been maybe too much about comment after, or a commentary about, rather than being there at the very beginning of a particular process, and therefore those things grow together. And I think you're right about asking the questions. I know when I've spoken to a particular colleague of mine about you talked about being scientists looking at something and trying to find out how that works and how that process is occurring and why that process is occurring. And what he likes about art is that the artist would then actually be challenging the way that he's looking at it rather than actually what he's looking at.
Yeah.
So that's something that's very valuable along the way, because it allows ideas or lateral thinking or thoughts or processes that might not have occurred in examining that particular, for example, a neurological process or the connections that are made between particular cortices of the brain. What if we then asked some very different questions while we were in an MRI scanner and we were looking at those pathways? What other sort of potential questions would get asked, which would then spark off conversations about other things around it. So it then becomes about being involved in that process and asking those questions from very early on in order to, one, make sense of it for ourselves, but also to make sense of it to humans, particularly if you're talking about the brain. There's this never-ending conundrum now about objectivity, and is there an objective universe that, of course, a scientist wants to observe and make sense of? But, of course, when you're looking at the brain, it's an irreducible problem because we are the thing looking at the thing that we're trying to explain to ourselves. So, it's something that I think being in at the very early stage and talking to scientists about as they embark upon new things, that can spark off different things for them as well as for us, and also then help translate it for us human beings.
I like that. And Briony, your discussion with scientists?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you said about being an artist embedded in a scientific organisation. I just wondered how many scientists get embedded in arts organisations. Maybe that could be a good thing.
Totally.
Yeah. But yeah, as far as the scientists enjoying, or what they sort of get out of collaborating with an artist. I actually collaborate with two different scientists, an astrophysicist who I do the rules and the drawing with, and then also a microbiologist, and we look a lot at the micro world and use drawing as a way to explore it, and we work a lot with children, as well as put on interactive installations and things like that. And we use microscopes a lot, and it's a lot about looking very closely. But I know that we enjoy the process of working together. I don't think that we would have I think, when you've been working with someone for a while and they're not someone from your field, it is, new opportunities happen, and there's different kind of media, and there's a different way that they're thinking about it and what they bring to it. So I think there's a strong enjoyment, on both sides, and there should be, because that's part of why you're doing it, and to create something new. And I think for Andrew, the astrophysicist, I think he's sits in a very, he's in a very academic world, and there's a lot of artists write grants too, but there's a lot of he's in more of a stricter framework than I am as an artist. So I think for me it's not as unusual to go and do a big drawing for 4 days, and everyone's in their socks, crawling around on the floor with tape, and he loves it, because and so do I, but to me it's a bit more normal, but I think enjoyment is a big part of it, and different point of view.
Can I, on that, there's this idea of cross-disciplinary collaboration, and not just about art and science, but I know that some scientific organisations, some scientific institutions are becoming more and more they're embracing this idea. I know there's a whole area of neuroscience called neuroethics, which is, I've only met one neuroethicist in my time, but this is a person who is now part of the institution, certainly at the Florey anyway, and he is someone who is constantly. He is that sounding board. And it's not just about the ethics of what the scientists are doing. It's also about the science of ethics. Why are we ethical? How does that actually occur in our brains? So in talking to him, I found it very interesting that he was someone employed by this Neuroscience Institute to criticise, to be an argument, a sounding board to argue against and to write about and write books and papers about. And I think that's
reflect.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think that's obviously one example. But I think from artists and other spheres of human endeavour, if they can start to be sort of more heavily involved in these institutions that are doing incredible work and work that is actually fundamentally about us, then surely that's got to be a good thing, and can only be a good thing.
Briony, you remind me that artists and scientists have to do a lot of damn grants. Mm-hmm. And Nobel Prize-winning biochemist said if Louis Pasteur were to come out of his grave because he heard that the cure for cancer still had not been found, the NIH would tell him, "Of course we'll give you assistance. Now write exactly what you'll be doing for the next 3 years of your grant." Pasteur would say, "Thank you very much," and would go back to his grave. Why? Because research means going into the unknown. If you know what you're going to do in science, then you are stupid. This is like telling Michelangelo or Renoir that he must tell you in advance how many reds and how many blues he will buy and exactly how he will put those colours together. I mean, as artists, we often just start and we're not even thinking. Has that been your experience?
I think there's that impression of the artist as, being very intuitive and not necessarily having a methodology like a scientist would. But I think it really depends on the artist. I mean,
yeah, you've all been talking about really purposeful methodology. I'm wondering if you just do have that free form.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I doodle a lot, and I do a lot of drawings that are based on what I'm seeing around me. And in fact, it's that kind of work that was a precursor to everything I'm doing now. That observation and just immediate response, and then reflecting on that, and then sort of developing it further. So yeah, I think that immediate response and that intuitive response is a really core part of being an artist. And yeah.
Leah, do you get to do it?
Yeah, a little. I mean, it has, within the process, the creative process, there's certainly times that are about kind of radical making, just brainstorming, material brainstorming, call it, sort of making hundreds and hundreds of small things. And that might be with, I just did a residency at the NGV as part of Melbourne Now, and I just sat with the public, and over 4 days we made like 700 small things. And they were just with this little kind of clay, and it was about just having a conversation and really speculating on what devices in the future might look like, medical devices. They could be seeds or pods or little flowers. Very, very intuitive brainstorming. But I think, the whole idea of iterative processes is something that's quite, really brings together art and science. So artists, we make things and we remake and remake and remake, and we find ways of solving problems through creative practice. And I think, scientists kind of mirror that process as well, where you're just, redoing the same experiments again and again and getting different types of results and sort of edging your way towards some kind of outcome. Yep.
Did you have an answer to that? I was
going to say, I think that it's ever been the problem in terms of writing grants and getting, the idea of trying to preempt what is essentially an organic, what you hope is an organic process, and it's very difficult. But I think it's ever been thus. And I think for scientists particularly, certainly the ones that I've dealt with, the need to medicalise or to have a particular outcome in research is very, very strong. And when I've met with particular scientists that I like talking to and working with, it's always out of hours, because in the daytime they're working on Parkinson's or epilepsy or these things, which have very important things, of course. Yeah. But when you want to talk about these other, this is like their side project. It's their Mr. Bungle project. They want to talk about it. They want to talk about all this stuff because it's fascinating and it's amazing. But I think certainly in the scientific, similarly, for artists, how do I sell tickets to this? What's the byline underneath this title? Those kind of things are inevitable concerns. And in the from the scientific community, I think also the need to have an outcome, a medical outcome particularly, is very, very strong and very is a real hurdle for them to jump over.
Reading a lot of biographies on scientists, I noticed that some will listen to music or do painting or change mediums or become involved with the artistic world. And sometimes when I'm writing, I certainly go and look at scientific journals for interest, for my inspiration. I'm wondering how, in any sense of the word, have you gained inspiration from the scientific community? And obviously it's vast and numerous, but maybe a couple of examples?
Would I say that when you're embedded in a space, that you're responding to an environment of excitement, so like, say, being in a laboratory with the kinds of materials that I work with, so magnetic liquids and shape memory metals, and just, I think that's really exciting, and it's actually being in there surrounded by the potential that is the inspiration. It's not necessarily going and reading a book about it.
No.
But it's being there and touching and feeling and manipulating things that you realise that then your creative brain starts processing and thinking about potential. What are the potentials of these things that I'm surrounded by? And that's when the innovation really starts to happen. I don't know. That's maybe not answering the question, but it's a different type of...
I just wanted to, for listeners, for audience out there, tell us a little bit about polarity, because that's just crazy with its movement and the shavings and everything. Tell us a little bit about it.
So polarity was an installation for the... for GOMA a couple of years ago, the National New Media Art Award, and it's basically this sort of very pristine white plinth, and on the plinth are about 30 of these little tiny they look like terrariums, and in each of the terrariums is what looks like a sea anemone, little black sea anemone that's kind of coming to life and waving around and then going back to sleep again. And when they're at rest, they look like a little bubble of balsamic vinegar in a pot of olive oil. And they come to life and then they go back to sleep, and there's no sense of why. It's like on a table like this, but much bigger. There's no sense of why they're coming to life or why they're going back to sleep. And I love this thing that happens, that people go and they try and they're like, what is it? Is it an animal? And they develop this really strong bond with these little creatures. So you can see there's movies online. But what it actually is just a chemical, and the chemical's responding to the presence of magnetic field. So ferrofluid, when you put a magnetic field close to it, it's basically nanoscale ion filings, and they all stand up at the same time, and it creates this incredible spiky surface tension. And you take the magnet away and they all lie down again. And so concealed within this tabletop are lots of rare earth magnets and motors and things that are making the magic happen, but no one knows that. And it's a really great experience. And I do love, my favourite thing is that people have different interpretations of it, and one of which is, it's my magnetism, I'm making it happen, and they try and play them like a theremin, which is very funny, but it's completely wrong.
Lies.
Yes, it's all lies. Yeah. And they get really emotionally concerned about them, which it's chemical. They're like, oh, it's gone. Where is it? Oh, it's over there.
But that material is so dynamic, and I've seen some video, and I think finding those new materials to play with. I mean, I think that's it's very attractive.
But it did take like 4 years to make it work, because it just is horrible stuff. And one thing actually with these materials is that there are no replacement materials, so it's all about material, haptic, tactile material knowledge. You can only learn how to work with that kind of material by working with it. Like you can't mock it up in balsa wood. It's like you must work. There's a truth in materiality. You must work with the material. It's the only thing in the world that acts like that. Yeah, or whether it's aerogel or shape memory metals. So there's something quite interesting in that, actually having to work with the very specific materials.
Yeah, if I was embedded like you are, I'd think I'd be inspired all the time. And I didn't mean to ask, I guess, such a broad question, but maybe tell, just before we go to the listeners, the audience again, Tell us what's next for you with science. I mean, you've got Fugue coming up. When's that happening?
Well, look, at the moment, it's we're going to do another development, sort of the final stage of development in October, and then talk to festivals and companies about it sort of in the next year. There's also another show that have started actually with the same neuroscientist colleague of mine, Andre Peterson from University of Melbourne, about a quantum physicist, and that's it's a show. It'll be a show.
It's a fictional one.
No, the quantum physicist is a guy called Wolfgang Pauli,
right?
And he is a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and he's quite an extraordinary human being as well. And that's something that is in the very, very early stages. So the Harlow play that I made, I've just adapted for ABC Radio, and that will be on a show called Hindsight, hopefully later this year. It's very interesting. It was a very visual show, so I was very surprised when a radio station asked me to adapt it for radio. It was a new challenge for me that I've not experienced before, but we'll see if that works.
Fantastic. Exciting. And Leah, what was one of the many things that you're working on that you could talk about?
So one of the things is that I'm embedded with the Advanced Textiles Research Facility at RMIT at the moment. So I started doing a PhD there, and that's really looking at, the role of creative practice in improving therapeutic technologies. And, that's really exciting because you've got sort of lots of kind of three-dimensional, 3D weaving machines and knitting machines. And within that, and also sort of coexistent to that, is working with St Vincent's Hospital to design a necklace to replace the cardiac Holter monitor. And as part of that, sort of looking at whether you can, weaving metals basically so that you can sense heartbeat. Because at the moment, the Holter monitor is a pretty ugly thing that you have to wear, and you can only wear it for a couple of days while you're in hospital. But thinking, could you design, something that's very discreet that people could wear for a number of weeks, and if they do have another heart attack or some sort of arrhythmia, all of that information can be, resident within a beautiful jewel of some kind that's got all your signal processing and your data storage. So working on that at the moment. They're the two main things. Yep.
Just quickly with that, is it also thinking about cost with that to keep it down, or is that, or do you aim high and then worry about that later?
Yeah. Well, that's funded through a philanthropic body, which is kind of interesting. So, I mean, you're constrained, you don't have loads of cash, but you can actually do a lot of work with not that much money. Yeah, which is interesting. It's the next stage that costs a lot. So innovation can be reasonably cheap. Yeah. Manufacturing, market, very expensive. Yeah. So that next stage, and going through, testing, user testing and all of that stuff, that's where the big investment needs to be.
Great. And Briony, what are you doing?
So I would like to continue to develop the drawing process and do another experiment. So I call them drawing experiments. So I've done 4. So I'd like to do number 5, and work with perhaps a larger group of people than 30 and over a longer period. So it would be great to do something over weeks and really see what builds up. And with the tape, it'd be great to see it, perhaps emerge in a 3-dimensional way. And also, I'd like to perhaps incorporate other elements like sound, or that also respond to the rules. And I've also been talking with a scientist about the notion of the commons and sharing the commons. So, things like the ocean are commons. And typically we find that when a commons is shared, it gets, it's about finding those rules or those parameters for preserving, say, fishing or the sea in as best state as possible, while still it being supportive to the needs of that commons. So, maybe it's a field with cows that's shared, or maybe it's a fishing reserve or something like that. So it's looking at what rules need to be in place for a shared environment to remain stable. So we're looking at how we can use the drawing process as a way to think about how a commons can be preserved and how people interact in order to sustain it. So it really is about sustainability and using the drawing process to sort of model, rather than doing it all on a computer and testing, just sort of acting it out. So, and perhaps even getting scientists involved as a way to being inside a model, not just seeing the data at the end. So that's one project.
I think the fact Melbourne is very healthy with its interest in science and its interest in art, and thanks so much to the Wheeler Centre for putting this event on. I could ask these people questions for a long time to come. Please thank Briony Barr, Leah Heiss and James Saunders. Thanks.